Greetings and salutations. There's a lot of chaos in this world, Hawk Watchers, from wars and conflicts to climate change, hurricanes, and earthquakes. It feels like every other day we read or see in the news that somewhere on this small planet yet another crisis and great tragedy is taking place. But what happens when governments fall short or even completely fall apart due to the size and cost of the disaster at hand? Who is there to help pick up the pieces? Oftentimes, it's NGOs or non-governmental organizations that are left to the task. But who are these people and organizations who most often selflessly try to bring order back to the chaos in an effort to save as many lives as possible? Today, we'll try to answer that question as we delve into the world of NGOs and disaster response, but from an insider's perspective, as only we know how. So let's start watching the Hawks.
If you want to know what's going on in your city, in your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world.
Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome everyone to Watching the Hawks. I am Tyrell Ventura.
And I'm Tabitha Wallace. The Global Disaster Immediate Response Team, or Global DIRT, is one of these NGOs who goes headlong into areas of crisis. Labeled extreme humanitarianism by Vanity Fair, Global DIRT's main focus is disaster risk reduction and response. We sat down with the founder of Global DIRT, Adam Marlett, in order to get a better understanding of the work they do, and started by asking him what inspired him to create this organization.
So basically, the concept of Global DIRT all started about 7 years ago. So at the time, I was transitioning out of the military and working with the State Department, and there were some people that I was still connecting with. So there was a giant earthquake that happened in Haiti, and pretty much we got contacted by some of the people that were on the ground. And they said, this is a real problem. We need somebody that can sit in the kind of the apex between the military and the civilian world because they speak really two different languages. And when you throw in a local and cultural context, it's a real challenge. So pretty much what we did is we inserted first, we weren't even really an NGO at all. We were just a series of people that were able to come together with this set of skills that we've gained from the military, and we're able to basically put them into use on the ground. So doing emergency medicine, medically evacuating people via helicopter, some of the large-scale logistics and dirty work that was really difficult for people to kind of work around in that context. And then pretty much ever since then, we expanded on that context. After the first 2 weeks in Haiti, when it became clear that this is going to be a long-term challenge, we decided that we would actually form an NGO, a non-governmental organization, and focus specifically on bridging that divide. So taking military veterans and emergency service professionals with these set of skills and being able to put them in an environment where they can be successful with the tools to succeed. So we kind of bring the latest of technology, if it's UAV drone technology, some stuff on the vehicle side, and the ability to rapidly get anywhere in the world within 24 hours to kind of make that gap happen. And so it's just gotten larger ever since.
Oh, wow.
What have been some of Global DIRT's major successes, and what areas have you been in since your obsession?
Yeah, so we've been really busy. So our work kind of focuses on kind of three core areas, and we're currently expanding to split actually into two different groups. The first area that we work in is that immediate response. So a sudden onset disaster happens, earthquake, tsunami, typhoon, anywhere in the world. So we have the capacity to respond, and especially in areas where there might be a pre-existing conflict or it's considered dangerous. So, since 2010, that's Haiti, Pakistan, New Zealand, Japan, New York City after Superstorm Sandy. The Philippines, they've had 22 typhoons of significant impact since we've been there and continuing to do it. And then Nepal as well. So it's kind of nonstop from that consideration. And then obviously we have ongoing operations that are kind of the second aspect beyond sudden onset disaster. So that's the long-term train wreck. So we've seen kind of the development challenges in Haiti and how that's not going away. So instead of doing that sudden onset where they're there for 2 weeks, we might end up being there for, in the context of Haiti, years. Or currently what we're doing in the Mediterranean, as far as inserting subject matter experts to try to work with NGOs in the area. So that's kind of the second area. And then the third area that we are involved in is more on the training aspect. So that's going to be actually spun off into its own individual entity. But basically, training in the local context, so we're working with our local partners from a host nation to basically teach them the skills. So it's ultimately cheaper when a disaster happens and a higher likelihood of success because they're going to get there a lot faster. And then also, working on bringing a lot of the people that have showed interest in volunteering with us but might not have the skill set, particularly for disaster response, so filling that void. So a lot of that's on the veteran community side. So working with military veterans that they know how to live out of a backpack, they know how to be in an austere environment, work with people that speak another language, and be friendly. That's the side, that the news doesn't show a lot. But really that's 90% of the work that's out there is non-kinetic activity. So taking those guys and giving them an additional toolkit on top to make them successful and put them out there, it really makes it scalable for us, especially as, there's no shortage of disasters that are kind of happening.
Exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry. You said non-kinetic environment. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, a lot of people see the military and they assume 0 dark 30 or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
But what they don't realize is a huge amount of our work. Like when I was in the Marine Corps or with the State Department. But even if you go to the the infantry aspect side of things, a lot of that was doing dental clinics for local communities, rebuilding schools, ensuring stability, ensuring it's safe enough that women can go to schools, especially after they enter their teenage years. So a lot of those things actually kind of merge in towards the humanitarian environment. Now, obviously, there's a clear line because we don't want humanitarians to be targeted, but unfortunately, that line's kind of already being crossed if you've with the kidnappings in Iraq and Syria. Yeah. So taking people that already have that skill set and then adding other things on top really makes them competitive as far as being able to get out in these different fields and help people.
Now, do you work? Does your organization work with like the VA and things of that nature? And how? And if so, how is that relationship? Been, and how is that? What could be better there? How has it been good? Give us kind of your relationship with the VA and how has that been?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the biggest challenges that you have with the Veterans Affairs, like any government organization, they tend to be, as an agency, maybe 10 years behind where everywhere else is at. But they've made some significant strides over the past 4 years with the previous administrator and coming in. One of the things that we're working on now is actually in some of our long-term development areas in the Philippines and Haiti, for example, we're working on actually setting up a college that will both benefit the local community with 15% students from the national governments in these areas and 85% military veterans. So they can go through, we're working with the VA right now to get it approved on the post 9/11 GI Bill, which is the funding that we give veterans and basically support them while they're going back through school. So they can actually go through, get a 4-year nursing degree, but at the same time, they're fully immersed in the local areas across the world. So they spend 1 year in each country. Wow. And then at the same time, after their first year, because we put them almost through a boot camp or an academy again. So they learn Firefighter 1 and Firefighter 2 and EMT Basic. After the first year, they're already a paramedic. So we can actually put them in the field if something happens. And it's ultimately cheaper because they're flying less distance, they're on the ground faster. So, they can basically deal with wounds and other situations before they become major problems. So.
It's incredible work, really, at the end of the day. That's really, really amazing work. I think clearly one of the first questions one asks after hearing all that is in going into, a disaster area and trying to put all these things together and doing that, what are the risks and kind of hurdles that you generally face in your average situation? It's an above average, it's a dynamic situation, but what are the general risks and hurdles that you face? On the context on the emergency response side, and really any humanitarian action now, because as we've seen, nowhere in the world is 100% safe. So the biggest challenge is identifying that risk reward. Is if we're going to put people into a situation, we'll risk a lot to save a lot, but we're only going to risk a little to save a little. So putting people into an environment where we know that they can be successful is important, but also identifying some of what we like to call the third order effects. So
I might be giving somebody rice today, but by doing that, in 2 months, I might put a rice farmer out of business because he can no longer sell his product. So we always kind of have to be looking at least 3 steps ahead. Sometimes we joke 14th order effects because, you know, for instance, like the ongoing challenges in Haiti, it's really a multi-year, you know, problem. That's kind of compounded. So like a really good example of that is some of our recent operations in the Mediterranean. So we've put people out there specifically to do intervention because, I mean, there's people drowning in the water. There were over 5,000 people drowned last year. That's basically like losing a 737 every week into the Mediterranean all of last year. So with that, we know that there's a very important side to that, but we have to also identify that our potential action might be increasing illicit activity, be it the smugglers trying to do things or change those smugglers' tactics, techniques, and procedures of moving people over, which is one thing that we've kind of seen.
Wow.
So that's kind of the always the challenge that we have is where are we going to affect, and we might save 1 person today, but are we putting 10 people at risk tomorrow?
Right, man.
It's probably easy for a lot of people at home to understand the physical challenges that this kind of work that you face, but it's probably a little harder for them to understand the political challenges. What are some of the sort of political red tape that you have to deal with when you're out there trying to help people in other countries?
Sure. Well, I mean, to go back to the Mediterranean example, it's really a complicated situation, right? Because it goes towards immigration rules, generally approved principles of asylum, and then also some core, you know, country as an entity issues. So for Libya, for example, because they don't really have any borders, it's a very porous situation. They can actually have situations where people are coming from multiple different countries and using that as an avenue to get out. So when people watch on TV, they're thinking, well, why don't those boats just turn around and go back? Or why can't you bring them back? But it's actually illegal because they weren't even in that country in the first place. So it would be like if you were illegally in the United States, then you went over the border to Canada in the middle of the night, also illegally, and then Canada tells you to turn around and go back. Well, obviously, the U.S. isn't going to let you back in. The problem being is there you're on dry land, but in the Mediterranean, you're floating 15 miles, you know, off the coast in no man's land, essentially. So there's some significant red tape there in that there's obviously there's actually UN statutes and even under the Geneva Convention as far as requirements of helping people in distress at sea. But by doing that, if somebody goes onto a flagged vessel and they claim amnesty, they're required to go to wherever that flagship nation is.
Wow.
So some of the people that are trying, as far as the government ships that are out there, are at times from the EU staying further back outside of the zone because they don't want to get into that situation. But they're also getting frustrated at the NGOs that are responding because they feel that by them picking up the refugees then and the economic migrants, that then they're increasing the problem. But the reality is that boat's not going anywhere.
As we go to break, Hawk Watchers, don't forget to let us know what you think of the topics we've covered on Facebook and Twitter. See our full shows at RT.com. Coming up, we'll have the second half of our interview with Adam Marlett of Global Dirt. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned to Watching the Hawks.
दीवारी में वो पैदा होती है और 4 दीवारी में ही वो मर जाती है यहाँ पे। जब लड़कियाँ औरतें यहाँ घरों के अंदर 4 दीवारी में मार खा सकती हैं आदमियों के हाथ की, तो क्यों वो बॉक्सिंग नहीं कर सकती?
जब मैं रिंग पर होती तो बिल्कुल मैं चेंज ही हो जाती हूँ कि मैं जैसा कि मुझे खुशी सी होती है।
मैंने लोगों की परवाह करना छोड़ दिया है, तभी मैं आज बॉक्सिंग भी कर रही हूँ और स्टडी भी कर रही हूँ।
मैं किसी चीज़ से नहीं डरती हूँ और मैं बॉक्सिंग इसलिए करती हूँ क्योंकि कोई मुझे छेड़े तो मैं उसको मारूँ।
I'm Tom Hartman, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture. We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
About your sudden passing, I've only just learned. You wore yourself thin, taking your last wrong turn. Your act got up to you as we all knew it would. I'd tell you I'm sorry, if only I could. So I write these last words in hopes to put to rest these things that I never got off my chest. I remember when we first met, my life turned on each breath. But then my feelings started to change. You talked about war like it was a game. Still, some were fond of you, those that didn't like to question or argue. And I secretly promised to never be like you. It's said one does not leave a funeral the same as one enters. The mind gets consumed with death, but this one quite differs. I speak to you now because there were no other takers. To proclaim that mainstream media has met its maker.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight. Give it to us. Redacted is full-on awesome.
So good.
The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Yeah, well, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, if you send us an email.
The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees estimated that at the end of 2015, the number of refugees in the world reached the highest it's ever been, with 65 million souls. That is higher than the number of displaced people following both world wars. In the second half of our interview with the founder of the disaster response NGO Global Dirt, Adam Marlett, we asked him just how his organization is handling this crisis. Here's what he had to say. One of the things that is a big deal that we've been talking about is this idea of refugees. And according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, at the end of 2015, the number of displaced people or refugees had reached the highest it's ever been. They were saying over 65 million people. What is Global Dirt doing about that? I mean, we have 65 million people around the world displaced, either economically because of war, like because of natural disasters. What is Global Dirt doing, or what do you hope to do to tackle that issue?
There's really two aspects the way that I look at that. I try to always be a positive person. Yeah. So on the glass half full side of things, one way that those numbers might be actually indicative of is the success rate when something happens. So previously, before large-scale humanitarian intervention in these modern ways of actually reaching people and knowing things are happening, people would just die. They couldn't even leave if they wanted to. They had no capacity, they had no cell phones, they didn't know where they were on a map. So the fact that those numbers are getting larger, I think, are in part in the fact that that first phases of intervention, rescue, and response are going kind of effectively. But certainly, I think the world has a long way to go as far as going through there. But that kind of almost goes, I think, in part, especially when you're looking at active conflicts on the military side or on the United Nations has several military stabilization missions. I think a lot of that also has to do with identifying how can we put what we call IDPs, internally displaced persons, how do we put them either in an environment where they'll be successful in, so a place that speaks the same language, a place that has similar customs, or how do we identify safe places within those areas and be able to build them up? Because the reality is, 65 million people, that's larger than half the population of the Philippines. Yeah. So the Philippines has said, we'll take all the refugees you want, but it would make their population go up 33%, which maybe that's good for tourism, but that's a long-term challenge as far as being sustainable.
It's interesting to me because when you mentioned Libya earlier and what was going on there in the Mediterranean, these, people just trapped in boats, and a lot of times I've noticed, and maybe you have too, is that there's certain elements of a crisis that, like Western media, which is the predominant media of the world, focuses on more than others. What do you feel are some of the things that, like, Western media has missed in, let's say, its coverage of Libya, if at all, or in other areas around the world where, like, wow, no one's paying attention to this. We're aware of it because we are neck deep in it, but no one's even talking about this. Like, what are some of those areas? And
what I think is really interesting is especially because the media's grown so much and it's almost kind of merged kind of into the entertainment side of things, right? So with that, it's cut the attention span so short on situations. So, you know, like for instance, Haiti received coverage for a year straight.
Yeah.
You know, you had the likes of all these different news anchors all over the place covering, you know, doing in-depth journalism on these areas. Now that's not possible. And I mean, I think that's the way the industry's changed a bit. You know, you have interns writing 3-page, you know, articles and pushing them up every 24 hours.
Yeah.
So not you specifically,
no,
of course, but everybody.
Yeah.
So you know, I think the depth of the story that you get is different. For instance, by 2013, the end of 2013, so about 4 years later, you look at the situation in the Philippines. That 1 year cycle was down to 3 months. Then you go to Nepal, which is 3 years, roughly 3 years after that, in 2015. That cycle was down to maybe 2 weeks. So the key way that is a challenge is especially a lot of these smaller entities that are more niche as far as where they are actually able to provide intervention beyond like the Red Cross and some of the archaic guys that are out there. Is that like they rely on that level of exposure to ensure that they are actually able to go through and fund things. So I think that short attention span almost is really causing a challenge for humanitarian actors to be able to successfully and efficiently get funding. On the other aspect of that also is if you're in a conflict zone, you can't really advertise what you're doing.
Right.
So like with us, when we're out on the Mediterranean, you won't see anything. You won't see a tweet. You won't see an Instagram post. You won't see anything on Facebook. You won't see anything on any of the major networks. One, because we're 12 miles off the coast of Libya, where you know contingents of ISIS and AQIM and some other bad actors are working, and you can actually see the fireworks off the coastline at night. So you know there's that perspective, but also you know just because for a general safety thing, the world is a lot different now. Yeah. So I think that's certainly a big challenge as far as the cycle is changing, and I think that it'll be really interesting to see what that does because funding is getting a lot more challenging, especially for smaller entities that are trying to you know really actually get on the ground and help.
One of the things that surprised me was that your group and a lot of NGOs are sort of running afoul of these rules about human trafficking and smuggling, sort of this idea. You've been accused of attacking, or you've been attacked essentially for colluding with human traffickers in order to save people. Can you kind of walk us through that and explain and kind of how do you respond to those kinds of allegations and what is it that they're not getting, or what's the miscommunication here?
Yeah, well, fortunately, everything comes out in the wash. So it takes long enough for us to actually basically just show what's going on, and it's easy enough. So with us, on our protection side, you know, we almost go the police route. All of us have GoPros on constantly.
Oh, nice.
Not for us to, you know, make footage and put it out there, but for us to protect ourselves and saying, hey, this is what the situation was. So the challenge is with any information when, especially these agencies like Frontex or Operation Sophia, when they're trying to generate intelligence, they're taking, you know, what we call human, right? So human intelligence sources, and frequently that's third person. So parties get switched in the story of who did what or where they were. So it was actually a really interesting and pretty bizarre situation. So basically at one point, and I think I have the footage with you guys, basically we got called in. There was pretty much like a SOS call from the Spanish Navy saying that a raft had capsized and there were people in the water. So our NGO on a boat that's flagged out of Germany, as well as another NGO called MOAS, which is based out of Malta, both responded, but our big boats go a lot slower than our little boats. So, so we pushed out our smaller Zodiac essentially out into the water, and they pulled out what they call a Powfinger, which is a little bit bigger. It's like a jet boat. So we immediately went in. So there's over 100 people in the water. These are people that have never even seen an ocean probably before this morning when they were, you know, pushed out to go out to sea. You know, often by gunpoint. And so we're pulling people there as quickly as we possibly can. Well, one of like the third-party actors in this scenario are these fishermen. So fishermen have been around the Mediterranean forever.
Yeah.
But they're in an interesting situation where they can kind of change their livelihood. So a lot of these fishermen are actually going out, and while they're fishing, it's kind of like a thing of opportunity to scavenge. So if an NGO is actually taking one of these craft, they'll try to go there and pull the engines off, or even try to take the whole boat back, which, you know, survival of the fittest, it happens. So for us, because we want to limit the use of these dangerous crafts that are on there, we actually will burn them if they're wooden, or we slash the entire thing and let it sink. But there's some NGOs that are more on the advocacy side, and they say, well, it's better to have them have something that's still floating than them to try to come out in something that's even less safe the next week. So it's challenging because there's all of these different actors. But basically in that situation, we actually got approached by one of the fishermen who was also pulling people out of the water because nobody wants to let somebody else drown.
Yeah.
And so we were able to grab them, and we transferred them directly onto the MOAS, which is partnered with the International Red Cross. And so throughout that, by third-level information, we somehow ended up in a Frontex report where they thought that we were picking up refugees or migrants directly from smugglers and then bringing them onto boats, because they didn't know that particular situation. Because beyond the the Spanish naval ship that was there, I mean, these are people that are writing reports in in Rome and in other areas. They have no idea how wild the context is. So, it's a couple exciting emails back and forth later, and it was resolved, and The Intercept ended up doing a piece on it and had our back, which is always good to have investigative journalism still on print. But it's always an exciting situation, to say the least.
I can imagine. So I'll finish today and just ask, what is your future? What are your plans, coming up this year and beyond? What are you guys hoping to accomplish by the end of this year, and then moving forward to the future? Yeah, and how can people help?
Well, the biggest challenge that we're kind of facing is on the scaling side. So by splitting up into two separate NGOs, one focusing specifically on education, on that veteran and local education piece that I'd mentioned, and then the other one's focusing specifically on humanitarian assistance and disaster response, that allows us to kind of hone back in. And because they're going to have a partnership together, the funding that through the VA will essentially support the other side as far as operations go, which is good. For some of our large-scale projects, like for instance in the Mediterranean, a lot of that, our ability to work, depends on large-scale donors. So we try to never advertise something that we can't do. Right. So rather than taking $10 from somebody online and saying that'll work for 3 months for us, which is not realistic, a lot of times we're looking towards larger donors or anonymous or corporate donors that are willing to help out. So one of the things that we're looking to do is redeploy out of the Mediterranean in a ship in a capacity primarily to gather that information that only the military is, and so we can feed it back to the Libyan Coast Guard so they can provide intervention before they reach the 12-mile zone, which solves that entire no man's land situation, or to be able to dispatch craft like what you saw in the video in the event that something catastrophic happens and people are drowning in the water.
Well, I got to say, Adam, it's amazing work that you're out there doing, and good on you for doing it, man. I think I think we can all say that that's.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this. We've talked about it, is this idea of finding ways for veterans, for people who've worked in certain areas or want to get into certain areas, having that ability to take those skills that you've learned, and you said the non-kinetic sort of stuff that we don't think about. We don't think about when we think about the military, and being able to take those things to save lives. I think that's such a great use of those resources, and I'm glad there's people out there who are making that possible and training people to save lives. I mean, there's really nothing better than teaching another person. You can teach a man to fish, but if you teach, a man to save a life, that's huge, and that's great. That I think really great that you're doing that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, no problem. And that is our show for you today. Remember, everyone, in this world, we are not told we are loved enough. So I tell you all, I love you. I am Tyrell Ventura.
And I'm Tabitha Wallace.
Keep on watching those Hawks and have a great day and night, everybody.